Greetings and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ and RJTV. My name is Eric Lecain. Here on the Jam, I tell interesting stories that have been going on in the world this week, things that I find interesting, and hopefully you will too. This week, the drought in China, the update to the Trump saga, the Bryant case, the plight in Myanmar, going to the moon, race to the center of the earth, all kinds of stuff. Now, I got a message from someone the other day on Facebook named Regina. She said she enjoyed our little show, and it was because she learned about so many things that her uncle didn't know, and she was able to do what no one else could, appeared to know more than her know-it-all uncle. So thank you, Regina. Thank you for watching the World News Jam, and thanks to everybody for spending their Sunday here with us. Now, our first story centers around China. Now, China always likes to be the most at everything. They have the most people. They have the biggest military, the largest amount of inhabited land. They, of course, have the most gizmos produced that break in the very first month you get them. But lately, they have broken another record, the longest heat wave. Currently, they are in the 76th day of an extreme heat wave. Every day this week, China, they seem to have broken a record for the hottest day ever. Currently, they are averaging somewhere around 45 degrees Celsius every single day. They have also recorded the highest low temperature in a single day of 34.9 degrees. People are sleeping in the malls, just trying to stay cool. But that aircon in the mall also has been a problem because China is dealing with electrical shortages. Many large cities such as Shanghai have had to go into the dark at certain points of the day just to conserve electricity. Now, looking back at the Chinese historical records, this has clearly been the hottest it's ever been in China. They have official records in China going back as far as 1961. Now, I know the records in the Western world are started in 1880, but actually there are weather records in China dating back as far as the 17th century, and even some records that date back to the 1st century, if you can read them. So, what can we discern about all these records? Well, it's never been as hot in China as it is right now. And there's another problem. Rain. China is also suffering from the worst drought it has ever seen, like a drought of biblical proportions. As many as 66 rivers have completely dried up. And when it does rain, it's massive downpours very fast for short periods of time, creating flash floods. In the city of Hangzhou, there was a short-lived rainfall, but the ensuing flood killed 21 people. The government has announced emergencies all over the country as fresh water is quickly disappearing. I mean, there have been droughts in the U.S. and in Europe and, of course, in Africa, but honestly, none of them have been as bad as what seems to be going on in China right now. But did you hear about this? I mean, I'm just really hearing about it now. It's been going on for months. Most of this has to do with the fact that China doesn't want anyone to know. Anything that shows China in a bad light is usually not reported to the outside world. I guess, it's hard to forget a certain pandemic that started there and how that was not reported right away. But even if it's not directly China's fault, they still don't want us to know. Now, there's not been a lot of sympathy for China right now because, as we know, they have been one of the biggest contributors to global warming on the planet. Many saying China is getting what it deserves. But this extreme drought could be bad for all of us, really. We already have had a taste of what can happen when supply lines are cut around the world. Many of these supply lines originate in China. Currently, besides cities having to cut back on electricity, many factories in China have had to shut down completely. They just can't keep the electric on because of the intense air conditioning that's needed. Experts have predicted that very soon a domino effect will be spreading out into the rest of the world, and that will happen because of this exceeding drought, which of course will make many countries a little more madder at China than normal, because why wouldn't China tell us about this? Why wouldn't they tell us what's going on? Taking a big picture of this, you can't help but look at the fact that there are 1.5 billion people living in China. How are they going to care for all these people without water? First of all, China is a huge exporter of fruits, vegetables, and processed agricultural goods, and many of these exports have dried up. In fact, that there are now shortages popping up all over, making it difficult to even sustain the local population. This is a problem on many levels because food doesn't grow overnight. It's done seasonally, and crops are currently not producing even close to what is needed. And what about the rice? What about the Philippines' import of rice from China? People sometimes don't realize how much the Philippines relies on China for its food imports. There's already been problems with prices on food here because of all the stuff we've been dealing with over the past 2 years. How much worse could it be if China's forced to stop exporting? But China's biggest dilemma right now is the issue of electricity. Much of China's electric is built on hydropower, but many of the rivers providing that power are disappearing, especially the Yangtze. That's China's longest river. It's responsible for an enormous part of the power grid in China. Across the province in Zhejiang, the hydroelectricity has dropped 50%. And with the extreme heat, residents need air conditioning 24 hours a day. This is not something China has ever had to deal with. Most of its power is used for industry, not residential. And here's another problem. Zhejiang usually exports its power to other parts of China. Something like a third of it goes to the provinces in the eastern part of China. Now, to deal with this problem, Zhejiang is firing up its coal-burning power plants. But burning coal may have been one of the most contributing factors to the reason behind this massive heat wave. And it sends China's goals of being rid of this kind of thing by 2060 into the opposite direction. Also, this is just a quick fix because China is also having a shortage of coal and has for the past year. And the ironic thing is that many of the big factories in Zhejiang produce solar panels, for solar power. So what are they going to do? Well, first of all, they need to protect the food supply. Right now, this is predicted to be one of the worst food shortages in China's history. The dying crops may take years to repopulate, so China is shooting chemicals into the sky to try and fix this. That process, I guess many of you might have heard, is called cloud seeding. They blast small rockets into the sky and spread this chemical into the clouds, creating a chain reaction. And this makes rain, maybe. Now, cloud seeding supposedly will produce as much as 15% more output from the clouds, so that's something. But is that enough? Now, we have been hearing about heat waves around the world a lot lately. US, UK, Australia. Of course, many believe it's just an excuse for news outlets to say the word climate change. But when you start seeing the sheer magnitude of this heat wave and the concurring drought, it's not just filler news. I mean, an average day temperature of 45 degrees per day. Scientists are currently making predictions that these types of heat waves will double by the year 2050 and will triple by the year 2100. These type of heat waves in which the temperature is more than 39.4 degrees Celsius, that is the temperature that is the start point from what is considered dangerous heat for humans. Now, this is predicted now for the mid-latitude countries. These are the ones that have seasons. But what about the tropical countries or the countries near the equator? Well, this is where the term extreme dangerous heat is used. That's defined as temperatures about 51 degrees Celsius or 124 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where we get to the point as to the question is, what is survivable by a human? Now, these studies are based on the average increase of 2 degrees Celsius per year. Now, of course, the climate accords that are going on right now, many countries adhere to trying to reduce that number. It's not going to decrease. However, it can be lessened with countries vastly reducing their carbon emissions. That's great and wonderful, but the immediate problem are in places like the UK. Remember earlier, they had an extreme heat wave. The UK is not supposed to have extreme heat waves. People don't even own air conditioners there because it never gets hot. And then all of a sudden, it's Africa in the UK. I mean, it should never be 40 degrees in London. But that was the temperature it was just last month. And this, according to records, was the hottest year it has ever been in the UK in 80 years. And did I mention Spain and Portugal? They also measured record highs in these past few months. Now, these are countries that are not supposed to be hot, but are hot. And what about the countries that are supposed to be hot? For instance, what's happening in the Middle East right now? What about countries where they don't normally have rain and they have heat that is very dry? This month, the temperature hit 53 degrees in Iran. That's 127 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that kind of hot might not be survivable for more than a few hours. Why? Because you can't sweat. Humans need to be able to sweat to release heat and cool the body. There's something called the wet bulb temperature, basically the lowest temperature that can be reached by evaporating moisture. The problem is once it gets over 35 degrees, the body can no longer cool itself quick enough to a temperature that can maintain normal function in the body. In dry heat of that level, a human cannot survive for an extended period of time. It doesn't matter what kind of climate you're used to. You know, in Saudi Arabia, they have high-powered air conditioners now, but in places like Basra, where the electricity is maybe on for 10 hours per day, or maybe Gaza, where it's only on 4 hours per day, if the wet bulb temperature exceeds 32 degrees Celsius on average in places like this, humans may not be able to live there anymore. In fact, studies have shown that the way the Earth is continuously heating up, the Middle East may not be survivable by humans in the year 2100. Now, here again, air conditioning may be a lot more sophisticated by then, but for use by who? Whether we realize it or not, the Earth is growing in population. And, at the same time, it's becoming less and less hospitable to humans. As we battle the Earth for a right to live here, the Earth is simply doing what it does. It evolves. The question is, can we, the humans, evolve with it? This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. My name is Eric Lecain. So speaking of evolving, let's take a look at what has evolved in the biggest story in the U.S., and that would be the FBI raid on Donald Trump's home in Florida. Now, in case you have been lucky enough not to have heard this story, or you simply have not been paying attention over the past few weeks, let's break it down quickly. The ex-president, Donald Trump, who was voted out of office in the previous election. Okay, now most of us know that. However, when he left, he took some documents with him, which doesn't seem so bad until you understand that some of these documents he took were classified documents that were so sensitive that if you took them with you, it would be illegal. So the Justice Department asked for them several times, and some of them were returned. However, Trump decided which ones he would return and which ones he wouldn't. Now, his lawyer said that he actually returned them all. However, that was not true. He did not return many of them. And some of the ones he kept were marked super duper classified, like the highest level there is. So instead of asking again and again and being lied to again and again, the Justice Department sent the FBI there to get them. They got a warrant, they went to his home, and they took them. Boom, done. Got them back. So now the question is, was the Justice Department within its rights to do that? And secondly, should Trump now go to jail, like the rest of us would, for stealing classified documents and taking them to our home? Now, in any type of raid on a home, especially one as a high profile as Trump, there are a series of documents that you will need. First of all, you will need the search and seizure warrant itself, 3-page document. It's the one where the judge must give the FBI permission to go into Trump's home and search and take anything that is on that list. Now, for a judge to sign off on a warrant at this level, there must be an absolute surety that they are going to find evidence of a crime. Now, we got to see the document, and it explains what they are doing, why they got the warrant in the first place. For instance, Trump is known for having documents containing possible nuclear secrets of the U.S., or Trump is known for having taken a document that has possible information on overseas spies, whatever. These documents are protected under something called the Espionage Act, and you can't mishandle or destroy government documents like this. We've talked about this before, but this document that they have is very important. It needs to be exact. The document the judge signed has to be perfectly exact with no mistakes on it, because as we know, if there was a mistake, Trump would be suing everyone. The second document, the second one we talked about, it's the receipt. That's the receipt for the property taken from the house. Now, this one we also got to see. However, it's very general about things they took from the house. Now, reading this document, we don't know exactly what they took. However, we do know that some of the boxes, there were documents that were of the highest classification of secret documents that you can possibly have. Now, the last document, the affidavit. This is the document that we got on Friday. This is the big one. This one has many, many pages and lays out the government's case against Trump. This is the document used to convince the judge to give them the warrant. This is something that you almost never see until a trial, because it is the case that the DOJ has on Trump. It has some very, very secret stuff, not only about the case, but about what's in the documents, those highly classified documents. Now, when the FBI conducted the raid, the Republicans and the right-wing talk show hosts came out and said that we need to see the warrant. So we saw the warrant. Then they said, we need to see the list of things taken. So we saw that. Then they demanded, along with the many media organizations, that we see the affidavit, knowing full well that they cannot show classified material to the public. So this went to court, and surprisingly, the judge said maybe we should see this and let the public see it. But of course, not the actual secrets. So they made it public this past Friday. However, most of the document is heavily blacked out. So mostly anything with names, any officials working on the case, witnesses, any strategies they may have in the case. And of course, any informants within the Trump circle are blacked out. Now, Republicans in general have kept quiet about this, even though some have demanded to see the parts of the document that are blacked out. But many believe that the reason some of the main Republicans have not been pushing this is that if we were to see the blacked out parts, it might not be very good for Trump. I mean, it's one thing to lead an insurrection, but it's another thing to steal state secrets. Now, Trump claims he was cooperating and that all they had to do was ask him and he would have given him the documents. That the FBI didn't need to break into his home. That somehow this is Joe Biden behind this, just a smokescreen to make sure that he can't run for president in 2024. But the thing is, they did ask for the documents on several different occasions. Back in January, Trump was made to turn over boxes of documents. However, he did. They just knew that there were many that were missing. They asked again for any classified documents Trump may have taken, and Trump's own lawyer signed a letter stating that Trump had turned over all classified documents, but the DOJ knew this to be untrue. They even went to Trump's home, met with his people, and Trump was there. They still didn't get what they needed, so the Justice Department realized there was no way to get Trump to return these documents, so they got a warrant, got it signed, and the FBI went in and took them. Now, Trump has now asked for a third party to be the one to look over what the FBI took, and that he wants them back when this is over. Really? Trump wants those documents back? Anyway, part of the reason why this is so very important to the DOJ to get these documents back is that Trump's home is not really a private home. It's a social club for people that want to be seen as rich. The problem is, who are these people? Back when Trump was president, there were 2 occasions where Chinese women thought to be spies were able to get into Trump's home and get close to him. One was caught with a USB drive with malware software on it for collecting data. Just recently, the FBI launched an investigation into a woman who claimed to be a member of the Rothschilds banking family. She was able not only to gain interest into Trump's home, but was able to regularly hang out with the Trump's inner circle. The woman, who is a Russian-Ukrainian, has passports claiming to be Anna Rothschild, a person who doesn't even exist. She has become good friends with Trump's son's girlfriend and could walk freely around the estate. She supposedly dazzled all those around her completely with these made-up stories of her growing up in the super-rich Rothschild family in Monaco. Now, that whole scheme has been uncovered, and the woman claimed that, well, she never said she was a Rothschild, and that she is the real victim here, involving her ex-business partner. Now, this doesn't explain the passports and all these stories, but it did make a lot of those Mar-a-Lago people spit out their drink. Now, like I said, the FBI has already obtained 2 different passports with the name Anna Rothschild on them, and it's been uncovered that she has been making money off fake charities in the Florida area. But this is why the DOJ is so interested in getting those documents back. There are many people going in and out of the Trump club. There could be many more people there for reasons other than just trying to be seen. And besides all this, the big question still remains, why does Trump want classified defense materials anyway? Obviously, many are worried that he may try to sell them or maybe bargain with them. In any case, Trump has kept himself in the news, whether he means to or not. Whether good news or bad news, he's always there week after week. So hold your breath, because I'm sure next week there's lots more to come. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We're talking about interesting stories going on around the world. It was January 26, 2020 in Los Angeles. It was a hazy day, a bit foggy with overcast skies. A Sikorsky S-76B helicopter was making a flight over Los Angeles with some VIPs. Flight time is about 30 minutes, around 79 miles. In Los Angeles, if you were to drive that, it would take you 2 hours. Now, during the flight, the pilot is told to use flight instruments to navigate because of the foggy conditions. Now, according to the rules of flying, when the cloud tops 2,400 feet, you must use your instruments and not your eyes. So the flight continues and is very routine. Traffic control gives the route. There's some looping that must happen because of the air traffic, so that's what the pilot does. The pilot then just needs to move to 1,500 feet. So at that point, radar can't see him at that height, but that's normal. Then the pilot says he's climbing to 4,000 feet. The controller asks him to hit the button that identifies him so he's sure that he has the correct helicopter on the radar. Now, everything seems fine. However, this is where a routine flight goes horribly wrong. Here's where the pilot did something that other pilots have become a victim of. He used his own eyes. He decided to climb to 4,000 feet above the clouds, and his equilibrium was off. It happens when you're in your aircraft, when you can't see the ground. You think you're going up, but your instruments are saying something else. You're sure you're going up, but in reality, you're actually going somewhere else. The inner ear can send erroneous signals to the brain that causes a spatial disorientation. This is known as the leans. The pilot is sure he's flying level, but he's not even close. The pilot radioed the tower that he was climbing in altitude when in reality he was going to the left and descending very rapidly toward the steep hills in northern Los Angeles. At this point, it's required for a pilot to use instruments only. But the pilot is under a lot of pressure to get the VIPs to their destination on time, and that destination was a high school basketball game. What the pilot was doing was against the rules. The reason is that between 2010 and 2019 in the U.S., 184 aircraft crashed because of the exact same thing. This pilot was very experienced. However, in the moment of his own surety, he got it wrong. He was very wrong. The helicopter was going 184 miles per hour and was descending at 4,000 feet per minute. Even if the pilot had realized he was wrong, there was literally no chance that he could have changed anything that was going to happen next. When he came out of the midst of the clouds, he probably only had around 2 seconds to realize that he and his passengers were only several feet from the ground. Only about 2 seconds to realize that his life and all of the people aboard was going to end. As the helicopter slammed into the side of the mountain, it ignited and exploded, leaving debris all over the hillside. The pilot, along with 8 passengers, died instantly that day. One of those passengers was Kobe Bryant, one of the greatest basketball players that ever lived. He was on his way to coach his 13-year-old daughter's basketball team, and she was sitting right next to him. All because of a trained and experienced pilot who ignored his training and violated a simple rule: do not fly by sight in cloudy conditions. All he had to do was switch on the autopilot. That would have averted the crash entirely. But many believe that the pilot did not want to disappoint his star client and wanted to get him to his game on time. This is known in flight jargon as continuation bias. It's an unconscious tendency among pilots to stick to the original flight plan even though the conditions in the air have changed. You think because you're so close, you can just make it. And in the last few minutes, you make the wrong decision. But the story I'm really moving toward is what happened after the crash. Now, of course, the wife of Bryant sued the helicopter company and the pilot's estate. And there were countersuits, but there was one suit that she brought against the sheriff's department. The $31 million suit that had to do with the pictures that the sheriff's officials took at the site. They took pictures of the site, including pictures of Kobe Bryant and his daughter in the burned up helicopter. Now, according to the sheriff's office, this is standard procedure. But they must log all the pictures of the accident for any investigation. However, the problem was that after those guys got home that day, they went out for a drink or were playing video games, and they showed the pictures to a bunch of people not in the sheriff's department, and had nothing to do with the investigation. There's a video of one of the sheriffs in a bar showing the pictures to a bartender and then showing them to his friends as they laughed for whatever reason. Now, the sheriff's department said that the video was actually the sheriff confiding in a friend after a very distraught day in the investigation. But Bryant's attorney said that the sheriff should have collected all the photos and not allowed officials to show them to 30 different people. Now, the sheriff said that he did make sure later that all the photos of the crash were accounted for, and they did point out that none of the photos have appeared on the internet. However, after 4 hours of deliberation this past week, the jury found in favor of Kobe's wife that by the sheriff's officials showing the pictures to their friends, they have caused her deep emotional tragedy, and that emotional tragedy is worth $16 million. Now, the sheriff had offered to settle the case before for $2.5 million. However, I think Kobe's wife really isn't in it for the money. She has a lot of money. I think she's just mad. Maybe she was suing them out of disrespect of her husband. Anyway, she's actually using the money in a charity foundation. But it got me to think, what would I have done if I had taken pictures of one of the greatest basketball players that ever lived just after he was in a fiery helicopter crash? What would I have done? Would I have showed them to anyone? I guess we hope that we're good people and that we would do the right thing because, well, the wrong thing, it's about to cost someone $16 million. This is Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday with us. Miramar. We have talked about them over the past 6 years on the show. We have seen them transform from a free and democratic society back to a policed state run by a corrupt military, that ousted their leader, threw her into prison. Well, they continue to make the news, and, well, none of it's very good. Now, first, remember the coup where they ousted the elected leader, San Suu Kyi? This came after the horrific situation of the Rohingyas, the people, an entire race of people that had no place to go. We've talked about them many times over the years here on the show. Well, it's been 5 years now since they were forced out of their country. Many call it an example of racial genocide. There's also many other things that have gone on, such as the ruling junta seizing power, throwing the country into total chaos, the massive sanctions from all the other countries. But now, in the news this week, in the midst of all this other stuff that's going on in Myanmar, they decided to arrest the former UK ambassador, Vicky Bowman. Her and her husband were taken to the Yangon Insan prison and charged with violating the Immigration Act, which carries a potential sentence of 5 years. Now, she was part of the special UK envoy back in earlier in the 2000s, and it's clear that the UK has been very clear about the junta's violent takeover of this country. Now, the current head of the UK envoy has recently been expelled from the country, but they arrested Vicky Bowman, and that's taken things a little too far for the UK. Now, this is an international attack on a British official. There's been multiple sanctions against Myanmar after the junta took over, which has driven that poor country to even worse poverty. The UK has always been clear on their stance against the military in Myanmar, and that's even before it took over. They said that what happened to the Rohingyas, especially nothing more than ethnic cleansing, remained committed to taking action to stop the brutality of the Myanmar armed forces. Many believe this stance is what has led to the arrest of the former ambassador. Now, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has already opened a case against the Myanmar military, who has objected based on jurisdiction. But of course, doesn't the ICJ have jurisdiction like everywhere? In any case, the UK has vowed a whole new set of sanctions against the country and will target businesses that are linked to the junta. But what about the poor Rohingyas? They were forced out of their country 5 years ago and driven into Bangladesh. What has happened to that near million people? Back then, the military launched a clearance operation to remove the entire race of people from its population. Here we get the idea of differences between whose religion is best and who has the most guns. In this case, the Buddhists have the guns and the Muslims do not. Most of the Rohingyas, they don't even have a country. In other words, even though they live there, the Myanmar government refused to let them apply for passports and denied them citizenship, even though they have lived there their entire lives. The military basically came in, burned their homes, robbed them, raped the women and the young girls. They killed over 10,000. The survivors all fled to Bangladesh, who will not shoot them. However, they will also not give them a place to live or citizenship. The international courts concluded that Myanmar military now plans to completely remove the Rohingyas from existence. Now, the military says all these stories are fabricated by the media, and they are simply retaliating from attacks against them. But this doesn't explain the mountains of evidence of attacks on the Rohingya citizens and the horrific ways in which the military removed the entire race from the country. And now we are here 5 years later. So what has happened? Many of the Rohingyas still in the same spot they were before. Stuck in an area between countries, not knowing which way to go. A full year after the clearance of people, reporters that talked about this were jailed under the Myanmar State Secrets Act, which prohibits people from speaking out against the Rohingyas. Those reporters spent 500 days in prison. About 2 years later, the U.S. announced sanctions against the head of the Myanmar army and several officials in the army. Thousands of Rohingyas are told that they can return to Myanmar. However, none of them have returned because they believe that if they do, they are going to die. Finally, in 2020, the ICJ ordered Myanmar to take urgent steps to prevent the alleged genocide. However, instead of doing that, by 2021, the Myanmar military took over the country, waged a bloody war against anyone speaking out against them or any type of dissent. Then on March 2022, the U.S. officially declared that the military there is performing genocide. That the plan of the government is to remove all traces of the Rohingya people. A few months after this, 2 leaders of the Rohingyas were assassinated in the camp in Bangladesh. This was just a few of a string of killings at the camp. Supposedly, many of these killings are done by the ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. The group is known as a terrorist organization that runs drugs in the camp and kills political opponents. Now, many of the children in the camp have been sent away to Indonesia, even Malaysia. Many of the young girls have been promised for marriage in those countries and have been removed from their families. One girl described the journey to Indonesia on this tiny little boat as the most terrifying thing she'd ever been on. She said a couple times the boat nearly flipped right over. Many of these children are sent there in order to get them away from the violence of the border. But the problem is, once they get there, what happens to them? Once they are in Indonesia, there's a group there trying to protect the children, but there's also a group there trying to use them for sex trafficking. Now, even though there have been rulings that many Rohingyas may return to Myanmar, they will not, because they fear they will be murdered on the exact day that they return. So many just stay in the camps where there are shortages of food, spread of disease, people trying to exploit them for whatever reason. This is as the Rohingyas, they are in people's minds. They're in the court system. However, they still have no place to go and no country to call their own, even after 5 years, as the children are being taken away to marry foreigners, hoping that in the future, as a race of people, that they won't just disappear. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We're talking about interesting things that are going on in the world this week. It was 1972. I was a youngster growing up when a color TV was something super special you had in your house. And I remember very well watching the Apollo 17 mission in which they landed on the moon. I used to riddle off facts to my grandmother about how it was the longest spacewalk and the longest lunar landing and the largest lunar samples brought back to Earth. Yeah, I could be pretty annoying, but I really love watching those lunar missions. I couldn't wait for the next one, but alas, I would need to wait a good 50 years because the lunar missions were shut down after 1972. They stopped going to the moon after Apollo 17. Why? Money. It was really expensive to send people to the moon. That has not stopped man from going into space. Man is continually going into local space, but hasn't ventured out very much since 1972. Until now. There is now a plan to go back to the moon. Why are we going back? Because it's there. So NASA's new project, the Artemis, is going to take us there. Tomorrow, there is a planned mission to test the massive rocket ship to see if they can get it to the moon and back with no problems. Now, there'll be no one on this flight, as that this is a test flight, but someone will be getting into the spaceship to go to the moon, hopefully by 2024. In fact, the idea is to put people on the moon permanently and build a community of people to study space. And after the last Apollo mission, it was deemed that it's not important to go to the moon anymore. There were actually 3 more Apollos planned, but they were all canceled. Back then, it was really about the race against the Russians to see who could get to the moon first. The U.S. won that race. However, since then, many countries have put people into space. Of course, still the leaders are the U.S. and the Russians, but now the race is on for Mars. And China and India and Japan, they're all jumping into it. The next frontier will be a trip to Mars, which is currently being planned, and that idea is that it will lift off from what will be the new station that's going to be built on the moon. Of course, in the old Apollo missions, the room on the ship was very, very limited, but this new rocket is huge. It's built big enough to bring 30 to 50 tons of stuff to the moon and then build stuff. Now, this mission's to the moon, which is supposed to lift off Sunday, U.S. time, it's scheduled to be 42 days long and will travel 1.3 million miles, basically to the moon and back. Now, this mission was actually supposed to happen years ago. However, it was delayed due to figuring out how to get over 1,000 systems on board to work correctly. And of course, the project is billions and billions over budget. But the U.S. government is on board. Supposedly, both the Democrats and Republicans agree on the project. They can't agree on much, but the moon seems to have brought them together. That's good because trips to the moon do not come cheap. The rocket itself was supposed to be around $6 billion. However, that has ballooned to $20 million. And the price per trip is supposed to be $500 million per launch, but that is now $4.1 billion per launch. They have already predicted that by the time they actually get someone on the moon, it will have cost $93 billion. Just to put that in perspective, the average cost of a Tom Cruise movie is around $93 million. The NASA Inspector General, he's the guy that looks into everything NASA and what they're doing and how much it's going to cost. He doesn't actually believe NASA's timeline of sending a man to the moon can be met. He believes that realistically, it's going to be 2026 before we ever see someone set foot on the moon again. But there's one other issue that has yet to be figured out. The actual landing on the moon will be done by the SpaceX Starship. And that has to be tested as well. And there's a host of contractors that make the actual hardware. Boeing's one, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, among others. And everything has to work together. All these companies must do their part for everything to work. I mean, this thing is like nothing else NASA has ever made. The main rocket itself is 322 feet high and weighs 5.7 million pounds, has a combined thrust of 8.8 million pounds. What does that really mean? Okay, it means a lot of thrust. The four rockets on the main rocket, the ones that blow it out of the atmosphere, they're actually refurbished rockets from the old space shuttle. Plus, there's a booster rocket on there for some extra. The whole thing is called the SLS and will carry the Orion on its nose. The Orion carries the 4 astronauts up to 20 days at a shot. 21 days at a shot. This part of the mission is fueled and propelled by the European Service Module, which was built by the European Space Agency. See, everyone has their part. Now, this launch that's happening today, Sunday, it will not carry inner-humans. However, it will carry 3 mannequins. Those mannequins will sit there in the seats inside the Orion capsule. Now, these are not your standard summer fashion mannequins. They will have multiple sensors built into them, which will record data on what the real astronauts will be experiencing. This is especially important when coming back to Earth. It seems that the return landing is one of the most dangerous parts of the mission, as they will be traveling at 25,000 miles per hour and entering the Earth's orbit atmosphere in the orbit at somewhere around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So they don't want these mannequins all melted when they come down. But on this particular mission, the tricky part is the orbit around the moon. The Orion will be flying 60 miles above the surface of the moon and will need to deploy its solar arrays to power up the ship. This will all be done in an unmanned ship. and will bring several payloads of these cube satellites and other instruments, collect data in space. So the ship has a lot of things to do in its 42-day mission. We just hope that nothing goes wrong and we get our monster rocket back safe and sound so we can be ready for the next mission. Look to the eventual time of getting our colony built on the moon. I can just imagine neighborhoods on the moon. I'm sure to be nice and peaceful, very quiet, no barking dogs, no garbage trucks showing up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, no chickens outside, and of course no air. But you weigh a lot less. I guess that's not so bad. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. It is Sunday evening. Thank you so much for spending your evenings with us. Now, talking so much about space, I wanted to talk about another place. I saw an article this week. Somewhere in the Arctic Circle, there's an old dilapidated building. It's surrounded by some of the most beautiful Arctic scenery you can lay your eyes on. And in the middle of an old crumbling building, there's a rusty cap embedded in the concrete floor. It's secured by a couple of old rusty metal bolts. Under the old rusted cap is what some people call the entrance to hell. They say if you listen hard enough, you can hear the souls from the underworld screaming to be set free. Under the cap, it's actually where the Russians had the idea to dig to the center of the earth to see if they can go deeper than anyone else in history. And they did. They got down to around 40,000 feet. However, there was a point where they finally had to abandon the project. The whole thing started back in the 50s when the U.S. and the Russians both decided to see how far they could go, how deep they could get, who could get there first. The original idea was to get to the mantle. The mantle's that mysterious place beneath the surface of the earth where they're not really sure what's going on there. In fact, many scientists have said that we actually know more about space and what's up there billions of miles out into space than we do from what's just a few miles beneath our feet. Anyway, the U.S. did not get very far in their dig, but then the funding ran out. They had to stop their dig. But later they were digging beneath the seafloor. This is where the crust is supposed to be at its thinnest. But the problem was they were not able to keep the drill ship in place. They installed a system of propellers along the side, but it seems when you drill like this, the hole needs to be perfectly vertical, which turned out to be very expensive. And with government funding and politics being what they were, what they are, they had to give up. Now, as far as the Russians, well, they started their dig in the 70s by using very specialized equipment. They were able to make a very, very serious hole, but the Americans started rethinking their hole. They began digging again. This time it was an oil field in Oklahoma. They actually thought that they had the deepest hole, but then the Russians, they went a little deeper in their hole. This is where I find things turn so very interesting. Yes, it's cool to see that you can dig the deepest hole, but the Russians discovered something that they had not anticipated. The hole was getting hotter, a lot hotter than they expected. Now, they expected it would get hot because, you get closer to the Earth's core, but the hole was not supposed to be what it was. It was supposed to be 100 degrees Celsius, but it turned out to be 180 degrees Celsius. And that's not all they found. All of a sudden, they ran into a type of rock, something they had never experienced before. It was kind of plasticky, not like regular rock. This was not very dense like regular rock. And, of course, that meant they couldn't drill through it. This turned out to be why the journey to the center of the Earth in Russia had to stop and was abandoned up there in the Arctic. Not only was it too hot, but also the drills couldn't get through that weird material. So, as of 1992, the hole in the far reaches of the Arctic, it's been sealed. But before they sealed it up, they brought up something fascinating, a history of life from 4 miles down, perfectly preserved fossils from around 2 billion years ago, tiny marine plants encased in the rock. And also, besides all these interesting discoveries, they found that 4 miles down, they thought it would be it was supposed to be granite that shifted into basalt, but it didn't. They found that granite continues down, down, even more down. And when they got there, they found that there's flowing water several miles beneath the surface of the earth. Now, scientists believe that the water is there because of the immense amount of pressure squeezing it out of the rocks. It's believed that in some cases, there are large bodies of water somewhere well below where we have been able to go. In any case, the hole the Russians made, it's all been capped up now. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, there has not been a push to revive the great project of finding the center of the earth. Actually, they are still very far from that point, but the Russians did make it very deep, enough to make it the deepest man-made hole on the planet. But the big question is the mantle, the massive space between the Earth's crust and the Earth's core, and it makes up about 40% of the entire Earth. But to get to it, well, we have a ways to go, around 25 miles, and so far they've only gone about 4. So in the race to get to the mantle, so far, no one's really come close. What's in the mantle? We can only make guesses. We're not really sure what's down there. Scientists have discovered some massive structures down there through seismic wave technology. They call them, you're going to love this, Earth blobs. I'm not kidding. That's what they call them. Now, that's an odd name. However, it's a perfect description of what they are. As of now, we don't know where they are, how they were formed, when they were formed. Some believe they are connected to supervolcanoes that could have been responsible for some of the Earth's extinction level events. But a lot of this is just a question because we still can't get really close to this part of our own planet. It's pretty interesting, though, how little we know about the Earth. We continue to spend time and time going farther and farther into space. But we've all but given up on traveling just a few miles in the other direction. Many believe that once we break the barrier between the outer crust and the mantle, we can start to see how the Earth was actually formed, maybe even how it was created in the first place. Now, are there giant caverns miles and miles below us where some dinosaurs escaped death and are still roaming in pockets of oxygen and running water? Well, most likely no, but it's very likely that there are some giant caverns far beneath the surface that could potentially contain life. Maybe life that we have never even seen before. But until the politicians or some really rich guy takes a bigger interest, we just have to keep guessing. What the heck is really down there? This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Thank you so much for joining us here on your Sunday evening. We will be back next week, so please join us then. So for now, everybody be safe out there. We'll see you next week.